The room was small, almost ordinary, the kind of room where one might expect quiet conversations or a family gathered around candlelight. But on this night, in the summer of 1918, silence carried a different weight. Heavy boots echoed faintly. Down a narrow hallway. Outside, the air was thick with tension, and the distant rumble of a revolution refused to sleep. Inside the house, a family waited. They had once lived in vast palaces where chandeliers glittered like frozen stars and halls, stretched so wide that footsteps seemed to disappear into marble corridors. Servants had bowed. Armies had saluted. An empire had obeyed. Now there were no palaces, no guards of honor, no throne. Only whispers. A father trying to remain calm, a mother clutching her children a little closer than usual, young daughters attempting brave smiles they did not quite feel. Somewhere in the darkness, history was moving toward them, step by step. For more than 3 centuries, their family had ruled a land that stretched from the frozen Baltic shores to the distant Pacific. Kings had fallen, wars had come and gone, yet their dynasty had endured. But power, like winter ice, can appear eternal until the first crack forms. Outside those walls, a nation that once bowed before them was now tearing itself apart in revolution. And within minutes, the fate of an emperor and the family who embodied it would change forever. But how did it come to this? How did a dynasty chosen to save Russia become the one it would ultimately destroy? Welcome to Old Money Chronicles, where we bring you fascinating stories of wealth, ambition, and rivalry from the world of the richest families in history. From glittering palaces to bitter rivalries that shape nations, we explore the dynasties that rose to extraordinary power and sometimes lost everything. If you enjoy stories like this, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and click the bell icon so you never miss an update. Join us as we uncover the legacies that shaped the world of old money. Asterisk, long before the Romanovs ruled a vast empire, before their name echoed through gilded halls and cathedral domes, Russia itself stood on the edge of collapse. The closing years of the 16th century were filled with uncertainty. Fields lay barren from famine. Villages emptied as hunger spread like a slow-moving shadow across the land. The throne of Moscow, once occupied by powerful rulers, now sat unsteady beneath the weight of succession crises and political intrigue. When Tsar Ivan IV, known to history as Ivan the Terrible, died in 1584, he left behind a country feared by its neighbors, but deeply scarred within. His reign had expanded Russia's borders, yet his brutality had weakened the stability of the state. The dynasty he belonged to, the Rudik dynasty, which had ruled Russia for more than 7 centuries, would soon disappear entirely. Ivan's son, Tsar Fyodor I, inherited the throne, but he lacked the strength and authority of his father. Gentle, quiet, and deeply religious, Fyodor preferred prayer to politics. Real power slipped into the hands of advisors and rival nobles, each seeking advantage in a court where loyalty shifted like winter winds. When Fyodor died in 1598 without an heir, the ancient Rurik line came to an end. Russia suddenly faced a terrifying question. Who would rule now? What followed became known as the time of troublous period. Between 1598 and 1613, marked by famine, rebellion, foreign invasion, and competing claims to the throne. In those years, the idea of Russia itself seemed fragile. False Tsars emerged, claiming to be long-lost heirs. Noble families plotted quietly in shadowed chambers. Polish forces marched into Russian territory, even occupying Moscow for a time. Ordinary people suffered most. Crops failed. Disease spread. Villages burned. The empire that had once appeared formidable now seemed painfully vulnerable. And yet, in the midst of this chaos, a family that had never expected to rule Russia slowly moved closer to history's center. The Romanovs were not kings, not conquerors, not even among the most powerful noble houses of their time. They were respected members of the boyar class, the high-ranking nobility who served the sun, but their influence had always remained modest. Their connection to power came through marriage. Decades earlier, Anastasia Romanovna, a woman known for her gentle nature and quiet wisdom, had married Ivan the Terrible. For a time, she had been the only person capable of calming the fierce and unpredictable ruler. Her presence seemed to soften his darker impulses. When Anastasia died in 1560, Ivan reportedly collapsed in grief. He became more paranoid, more violent. Many historians believe that her death marked the beginning of the darkest period of his reign. Though she was gone, her family name lingered in the corridors of Russian power. One of her relatives, Fyodor Nikitich Romanov, would become a central figure in the family's rise. A thoughtful and capable nobleman, Fyodor possessed both political intelligence and spiritual authority, but in a court filled with suspicion, rising influence often invited danger. When Boris Godunov, another powerful noble, claimed the throne after Fyodor I's death, he viewed the Romanovs as potential rivals. Fyodor Nikitich was arrested, forced into religious exile, taking the name Filaret as a monk. It might have ended there. Many noble families disappeared into obscurity during those chaotic years. But history has a peculiar habit of preserving certain names. Filaret had a son. His name was Mikhail Romanov. At the time, Russia descended into turmoil. Mikhail was just a child. He grew up far from the center of political life, raised in monasteries and quiet rural estates, while armies marched and pretenders fought for the throne. By the early 17th century, however, Russia had grown exhausted from chaos. The people longed not for glory, but for stability. Noble families and church leaders gathered in 1613 for a national assembly known as the Zemsky Sober. Determined to restore order, the question before them was simple, yet immense. Who could unite Russia? Many powerful candidates existed. Experienced generals, wealthy nobles. Ambitious claimants, backed by foreign armies. Yet those very qualities made them dangerous. Powerful men inspired fear. What Russia needed, Mani Belibed, was someone young, someone unthreatening, someone whose family carried just enough connection to legitimacy without carrying the weight of dangerous ambition. Their choice fell upon 16-year-old Mikhail Romanov. At the time, the young man was living quietly with his mother in a monastery near Kostroma, far from the intrigues of Moscow, when the delegation arrived to inform him of his selection as Tsar. Legend says his mother initially refused. She feared for her son's life, and with good reason. In recent years, several rulers had been murdered, overthrown, or betrayed. But Russia had already made its decision. Mikhail would become Tsar of all Russia. According to later chronicles, members of the assembly declared, "Let the young Mikhail rule, so that Russia may finally know peace." It was a moment filled with symbolism. A frightened teenager, a wounded nation, a dynasty born not from conquest but from desperation. On the 21st of February 1613, Mikhail Romanov accepted the crown. Few could have imagined what that decision would mean for the centuries to come. The Romanov dynasty had begun. What started as a fragile attempt to restore stability would grow into one of the most powerful royal houses in world history, ruling an empire that stretched across continents. But even at its birth, the seeds of its future fate were quietly present. The Romanovs had been chosen by the will of a desperate nation. And one day, that same nation would decide it no longer needed them. When Mikhail Romanov accepted the crown in 1613, he did not inherit a triumphant empire. What he received instead was a wounded nation scarred by war, divided by factions, and exhausted by years of uncertainty. Russia was not simply unstable, it was fragile. Cities had been looted during foreign invasions. Fields lay abandoned from famine. Rival nobles still eyed the throne with quiet ambition, and many people across the country had grown accustomed to the dangerous rhythm of changing rulers. For the young Tsar, the challenge was not conquest. It was survival. At just 16 years old, Mikhail lacked the experience of seasoned statesmen. Yet, the very qualities that had made him a safe choice for the thronist youth, his humility, and his lack of powerful enemies, became unexpected advantages. He ruled cautiously. Rather than attempting dramatic reforms or military campaigns, Mikhail focused on restoring order piece by piece. His court worked slowly to rebuild the institutions that had collapsed during the time of troubles. Taxes were reorganized, trade routes reopened, communication between distant provinces was restored. It was not the kind of rule that inspired songs or heroic legends, but it was precisely what Russia needed. Even more important was the return of someone who would become one of the most influential figures in the early Romanov dynasty. In 1619, after years of captivity in Poland, Nikitich Romanov, Mikhail's father, returned to Russia. By then he had fully embraced his monastic identity as Patriarch Filaret, the head of the Russian Orthodox Church. His arrival changed everything. Filaret possessed the political experience that his son lacked. More importantly, he carried enormous authority within the church, which remained the spiritual heart of Russian society. In practice, Russia now had two rulers. The young Tsar and the powerful Patriarch. Father and son governed together. Filaret focused on strengthening central authority, rebuilding diplomatic ties, and reorganizing the state administration. Under their combined leadership, the monarchy began to regain the stability it had lost. Foreign conflicts were gradually settled. In 1680, the Truce of Delino ended years of warfare with the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Though Russia lost certain territories, the agreement bought something far more valuable: time. Time to recover. Throughout the 1620s and 1630s, the Romanov government quietly worked to strengthen the foundations of the state. New laws improved tax collection. Fortifications were rebuilt along vulnerable borders. Trade slowly revived as merchants regained confidence in the stability of the crown. Russia was still poor compared with the wealthy kingdoms of Western Europe, but it was no longer collapsing. Mikhail's reign lasted 32 years, ending with his death in 1645. By then, the fragile experiment of the Romanov dynasty had begun to look like something far more permanent. For the first time in decades, Russia had experienced a long period without violent succession. The throne passed smoothly to his son. And with that peaceful transition, the Romanovs gained something priceless in royal politics: legitimacy. The new ruler, Tsar Alexei I, inherited a country that was stronger than the one his father had received. Yet Alexei was not content merely to preserve stability. Under his rule, the Romanov dynasty began to expand its power more confidently. Alexei, who ruled from 1645 to 1676, was known for his intelligence and deep religious devotion. Like many rulers of his time, he believed strongly that the monarchy existed by divine will. Yet he also understood that governing a vast and growing country required stronger administration. His reign marked an important shift. Under Alexei, the Russian state grew more centralized. Laws were organized into a comprehensive legal code known as the Sobornoye Ulozhenie of 1649, which strengthened the authority of the Tsar, while tightening control over the population. One of the most consequential decisions of his rule involved the status of peasants. By the mid-17th century, many peasants had begun fleeing their lands to escape heavy taxation and labor obligations. To prevent this loss of manpower, the new legal code formally bound peasants to the estates where they were born. This decision effectively solidified the system of serfdom in Russia. Millions of peasants became legally tied to the land and to the nobles who owned it. It ensured stability for landowners and strengthened the agricultural economy. But it also created a deep divide within Russian society. The empire was stabilizing, but beneath the surface, resentment quietly grew. Reign also saw the expansion of Russia's borders. explorers and settlers moved steadily eastward across the vast forests and rivers of Siberia, establishing forts and trading settlements. The Russian frontier stretched farther each year, bringing new resources and new territories under the authority of the crown. Yet even as the empire expanded geographically, tensions within its spiritual heart began to emerge. During the 1650s, Patriarch Nikon, one of the most powerful religious leaders in Russia, attempted to reform the practices of the Orthodox Church. His intention was to align Russian religious rituals with those used in the Greek Orthodox tradition. But many believers refused to accept the changes. To them, the old rituals were sacred and unalterable. The conflict led to a major religious division, known as the Roscoe, or the Old Believer Schism. Thousands rejected the reforms and were persecuted for their refusal. Some communities chose exile rather than submission. What had begun as a theological dispute soon revealed something deeper. Russia was not a single, unified society. It was a land of competing beliefs, loyalties, and traditions. For the Romanovs, the lesson was clear. Holding power over such a vast empire would require not only authority, but constant vigilance. By the time Alexei died in 1676, the Romanov dynasty had survived its fragile beginnings and grown into a firmly established, ruling house. The monarchy commanded loyalty from nobles, authority from the church, and obedience from millions of peasants. From the outside, the dynasty now appeared secure. The Romanovs had transformed from uncertain newcomers into rulers of a stabilized kingdom. But history rarely moves in straight lines. In the generations that followed, the Romanovs would pursue something far greater than stability. They would pursue greatness. And one ruler in particular, a towering figure of restless ambition, would change Russia forever. His name was Peter. And the empire he envisioned would be unlike anything the Romanovs had ruled before. By the late 17th century, the Romanov dynasty had survived its fragile beginnings and secured its place upon the Russian throne. Yet stability alone rarely satisfies ambitious rulers. Russia was vast, rich in land and potential, but compared with the kingdoms of Western Europe, it remained distant from the centers of innovation, naval power, and modern governance. Into this world stepped a ruler who refused to accept Russia's limitations. His name was Peter Romanov, remembered by history as Peter the Great. Born in 1672, Peter grew up in a court filled with intrigue and rivalry. The Romanov household itself was divided between powerful family factions, and political tension shaped much of his early life. At the age of 10, Peter technically became Tsar alongside his half-brother Ivan V, though real power was held by their older sister, Sophia, who acted as regent. These early years exposed Peter to the dangerous nature of Russian politics. Conspiracies unfolded within palace walls. Alliances shifted quickly. Authority could change overnight. Perhaps it was this unstable environment that shaped Peter's relentless determination. Unlike many royal children raised in strict ceremonial traditions, Peter showed little interest in the quiet routines of court life. He preferred activity, experimentation, and practical learning. In the outskirts of Moscow, he spent hours studying ships, tools, and military equipment. He even created mock armies among his young companions, drilling them in military exercises. What seemed like childish games would later become the foundation of a professional Russian army. Peter possessed a restless curiosity about the wider world. Russia, at the time, remained largely isolated from the cultural and technological developments transforming Europe. Western cities had universities, advanced shipbuilding industries, and sophisticated military systems. Russia, by contrast, relied heavily on older traditions. Peter wanted to see these advancements for himself. In 1697, he launched a remarkable journey known as the Grand Embassy. Unlike most monarchs, Peter traveled through Europe almost anonymously, working alongside craftsmen and shipbuilders to understand their techniques. He visited the shipyards of the Dutch Republic, studied artillery in Prussia, and observed the naval power of England. The experience left a profound impression on him. Peter realized that if Russia hoped to compete with Europe's rising powers, it would need transformation, deep, sweeping transformation. When he returned to Russia in 1698, he began implementing reforms with extraordinary energy. The first changes appeared in the military. Peter reorganized the Russian army into a modern, disciplined force, trained according to European methods. New weapons were introduced. Officers were trained in advanced tactics. Recruitment expanded dramatically, drawing soldiers from across the empire. But the most ambitious part of his military vision lay not on land, it lay on the sea. Russia had long struggled with limited access to major waterways that remained ice-free throughout the year, without strong ports. Russia's trade and naval influence remained restricted. Peter was determined to change that. His opportunity came during the Great Northern War, 1700–721, a long and brutal conflict against the powerful Swedish Empire. At the time, Sweden dominated much of the Baltic Sea, controlling vital trade routes. Peter's early campaigns were disastrous. Russian forces suffered humiliating defeats, particularly at the Battle of Narva in 1700, where Sweden's experienced army overwhelmed Peter's inexperienced troops. For many rulers, such a defeat might have ended their ambitions. For Peter, it became motivation. Over the next 2 decades, he rebuilt and strengthened his army while continuing to modernize Russia's institutions. Factories producing weapons and ships appeared across the empire. New administrative systems replaced outdated bureaucracies. Slowly, Russia began to change. The decisive moment came in 1709. During the Battle of Poltava, in modern-day Ukraine, Peter's newly organized army confronted the Swedish forces led by the formidable King Charles XII. This time, the outcome was different. Russia emerged victorious. The battle marked a turning point in European power. Sweden's dominance faded, and Russia began its rise as a major continental force. Yet, Peter's greatest symbol of transformation was not a battlefield. It was a city. In 1703, even before the war had fully turned in Russia's favor, Peter began constructing a new capital along the marshy banks of the Niva River. The location was difficult, even hostile. The ground was wet and unstable. Harsh winds swept in from the Baltic Sea. Thousands of laborers worked under brutal conditions to build roads, canals, and stone buildings where only swamps had existed before. Many died during the construction. But Peter remained determined. The city would become STP, Petersburg. 2. It represented something far greater than a new capital. It was a declaration that Russia would no longer remain isolated from Europe. As he famously declared, Russia must open a window to Europe. Wide avenues, grand palaces, and elegant canals soon began to rise from the marshland. European architects were invited to design buildings. Nobles were ordered to construct residences there, forcing the Russian elite to relocate from Moscow in 1712. St. Petersburg officially became the capital of Russia. The transformation was astonishing. Within a generation, Russia had shifted from a largely inward-looking kingdom into an emerging European empire. Peter's reforms reached deep into everyday life. He reorganized government ministries, introduced new taxation systems, and required noblemen to serve in state or military positions to maintain their privileges. He even changed cultural customs. Russian nobles were ordered to adopt Western clothing and shave their traditional long beards. A famous tax was imposed on those who wished to keep them. To many Russians, these changes felt shocking. Peter's reforms modernized the empire, but they also widened the distance between the ruling elites and the ordinary people who labored in villages and fields. The empire was becoming stronger, richer, and more influential, but it was also becoming more unequal. In 1721, after Russia's victory in the Great Northern War, Peter adopted a new title, Emperor of all Russia. This moment transformed the Romanov monarchy. No longer merely ruling a distant kingdom, the Romanovs now presided over a powerful empire stretching across continents. Russia had entered the stage of European great powers. The dynasty that had once been chosen to restore stability during a desperate national crisis had now become something far larger. A ruling house commanding armies, cities, and vast territories. But the splendor of Romanov power came at a price. The grand palaces of St. Petersburg were built by the labor of countless peasants. The empire's wealth rested upon a rigid system that tied millions of people to the land. From the outside, the Romanovs appeared unstoppable. Yet, beneath the glitter of imperial success, tensions were quietly accumulating, tensions that future generations of rulers would struggle to control. For now, however, the Romanov dynasty stood at the height of its early triumph. The empire had been built, but holding it together would prove far more difficult. By the early 19th century, the Romanov Empire stretched across an enormous portion of the earth. From the frozen forests of the north to the fertile plains of Ukraine and the distant edges of Siberia, Russia appeared vast, powerful, and secure. Yet beneath this immense landscape, quiet dissatisfaction was growing. The Romanov rulers had built their authority on autocracy, the belief that the Tsar ruled by divine right and answered only to God. For generations, this system had brought stability. It had allowed rulers like Peter the Great to transform Russia into a formidable empire. But the world beyond Russia's borders was changing across Europe. New ideas were spreading, ideas about constitutional government, individual rights, and limits on royal power. Revolutions had erupted in America in 1776 and France in 1789, shaking the foundations of traditional monarchy. Russian nobles and military officers, especially those who traveled abroad during the Napoleonic Wars, 1803 to 1815, witnessed these transformations firsthand. They returned home with questions. Why did Russia still cling to absolute rule while other nations experimented with constitutions and representative governments? Why were millions of peasants still bound to land as serfs while Europe was slowly abandoning such systems? These questions grew louder after the death of Tsar Alexander I in 1825. Alexander had ruled during a dramatic period of Russian history, including the defeat of Napoleon Bonaparte during the French invasion of Russia in 1812. His reign had raised hopes among some reform-minded nobles that Russia might gradually adopt political changes. But when Alexander died unexpectedly in December 1825, confusion surrounded the succession. The throne was meant to pass to his brother Constantine, but Constantine had secretly renounced his claim. This left the crown to another brother, Nicholas, who would become Tsar Nicholas I during this uncertain transition. A group of Russian army officers decided to act. On the 14th of December 18, several thousand soldiers gathered in Senate Square in St. Petersburg, refusing to swear loyalty to Nicholas. Their leaders later, known as the Decembrists, demanded sweeping reforms. Some wanted a constitutional monarchy, where the Tsar's power would be limited by law. Others demanded the complete abolition of autocracy and the creation of a republic. Their protest was not merely political. Many of these officers had fought bravely in Europe against Napoleon. They had seen societies where governments were beginning to recognize the rights of citizens. They believed Russia could follow a similar path. But their movement was disorganized and uncertain. They had courage, but little coordination. The uprising quickly faltered when the expected support from other military units failed to appear. Nicholas I responded with decisive force. Cannons were brought into Senate Square. When the rebels refused to disperse, the artillery opened fire. Smoke filled the winter air as the rebellion collapsed within hours. The leaders of the Decembrist movement were arrested. 5 of them were later executed by hanging in July 1826, while many others were sent into harsh exile in Siberia, where they would spend the rest of their lives. For Nicholas I, the revolt confirmed his deepest fear, that dangerous ideas from the West threatened the stability of the Russian Empire. His response was to tighten control even further. Nicholas famously declared the guiding principles of his reign as orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality. These words formed the ideological foundation of Romanov rule for decades to come. The Orthodox Church would strengthen spiritual unity. Absolute monarchy would maintain political order, and Russian national identity would stand firm against foreign influences. For a time, this doctrine appeared effective. Revolutionary movements were suppressed. Censorship increased. Secret police monitored political dissent. The empire remained stable, but stability achieved through fear often carries a hidden cost. The revolt had revealed something the Romanovs could no longer ignore. Even within the ranks of their own officers, men raised to defend the empire had begun to grow. The rivalry between absolute power and the desire for reform had now begun. And once such a conflict emerges within a society, it rarely disappears quietly. The crushing of the Decembrist revolt in 1825 sent a clear message across the Russian Empire. The Romanov throne would tolerate no challenge. Reform, if it came at all, would come slowly and only by the will of the Tsar. Under Nicholas I, Russia entered an era of rigid control. Nicholas ruled from 1825 to 1855, and his reign was shaped by a deep fear of revolution. The uprising in Senate Square had left a lasting impression on him. To Nicholas, the Decembrists were not misguided patriots, but dangerous radicals who threatened the stability of the state. He believed Russia stood at a crossroads. Either the empire would remain firmly rooted in tradition, protected by faith and absolute monarchy, or it would be torn apart by the same revolutionary forces that had shaken Europe. Nicholas chose the first path. His government expanded censorship across the empire. Newspapers and books were carefully monitored. Universities were placed under strict supervision. Political discussion that questioned the authority of the monarchy was quickly silenced. Even private conversations were sometimes reported to the third section, the Tsar's secret police organization created to monitor dissent. For a time, this system maintained order. Yet repression does not erase problems. It merely pushes them into silence. While Nicholas enforced strict control at home, the outside world continued to evolve. Industrialization accelerated across Western Europe. Railways expanded trade and communication. Political institutions slowly adapted to growing demands for representation. Russia, however, struggled to keep pace. Its economy remained heavily dependent on agriculture, and millions of peasants still lived under the restrictions of a system that bound them to the land and to the noble estates where they were born. The empire's vast size concealed these weaknesses for years, but they became painfully clear during a major international conflict. In 1853, war broke out between Russia and a coalition of powers, including the Ottoman Empire, Britain, and France. The conflict, known as the Crimean War, 1853-1856, would expose the limitations of the Romanov state. Russian soldiers fought with courage, but the empire's outdated infrastructure and military organization became glaring disadvantages. Supplies lines faltered. Weapons were less advanced than those used by Western armies. Communication across Russia's enormous territory was slow and inefficient. After 3 difficult years, Russia was forced to accept defeat. The loss shocked the empire. For the first time in generations, many Russian leaders openly recognized that the country needed serious reform. Without change, Russia risked falling permanently behind the rest of Europe. In 1855, during the final stages of the war, Nicholas died, leaving the throne to his son, Alexander II. The new Tsar faced a difficult inheritance. He ruled a proud but troubled empire, one that was powerful in territory but increasingly fragile in structure. Alexander II understood that continuing his father's rigid policies might only deepen the crises. Soon after taking the throne, he reportedly told a gathering of nobles, "It is better to abolish serfdom from above than to wait for it to abolish itself from below." Those words revealed both caution and urgency. The Romanov monarchy had long relied on the loyalty of the nobility, whose wealth depended heavily on serf labor. Changing this system would challenge powerful interests across the empire. Yet Alexander believed the risk of inaction was greater. After years of discussion, commissions, and negotiations with landowners, a historic reform was announced in 1861. Alexander II issued the Emancipation Manifesto, freeing more than 23 million serfs across the Russian Empire. It was one of the most significant social transformations in Russian history. For centuries, peasants had lived under legal restrictions that tied them to estates, limiting their movement and economic freedom. The reform granted them personal liberty and the right to own property. Across the countryside, church bells rang to announce the decree. Many peasants celebrated, believing that a new era had begun. Yet the reality proved far more complicated. Although serfs were now legally free, they were required to make long-term payments to the state for the land they received. The land itself was often limited or of poor quality. Many peasants remained deeply impoverished, struggling under new financial burdens. Meanwhile, landowners resented the reform for weakening their authority. The emancipation satisfied no one completely. Liberals argued that the reforms did not go far enough. Conservatives believed they had gone too far. Revolutionary groups began to emerge, claiming that meaningful change would never come from the monarchy itself. Among the most radical of these organizations was Narodnaya Volya, or the People's Will. Its members believed that political violence was justified if it could bring about the end of autocratic rule. Over the years, they attempted several assassinations against the Tsar. Alexander II survived attempts involving explosives, gunfire, and carefully planned ambushes. Each failure seemed only to strengthen the determination of those who opposed him. Then, on the 13th of March, 1881, in the streets of St. Petersburg, their plan finally succeeded. As the Tsar's carriage traveled through the city, a bomb exploded nearby. When Alexander stepped from the damaged carriage to inspect the scene, another conspirator approached and threw a second bomb directly at his feet. The explosion mortally wounded him. The reforming Tsar, who had freed the serfs, died in the streets of his own capital. The event shocked the empire. Alexander II had attempted to change Russia gradually, believing reform could preserve the monarchy while improving society. Instead, his efforts had intensified the struggle between reform and resistance. His death left the Romanov dynasty facing a painful dilemma. If reform invited revolution and repression invited resentment, then how could the empire remain stable at all? The assassination of Tsar Alexander II in 1881 sent a shock through the Russian Empire that could be felt from the palaces of St. Petersburg to the distant villages of Siberia. For many, it seemed like the violent confirmation of a troubling truth. Reform had not brought stability. Instead, it had exposed the deep fractures within Russian society. When Alexander's son ascended the throne as Tsar Alexander III, the Romanov dynasty made a decisive choice. The cautious reforms of the previous reign would not continue. In their place would come a return to firm, uncompromising authority. Alexander III ruled from 1881 to 1894, and his philosophy of governance was simple. Strength, the new Tsar, believed that weakness had invited revolution. The only way to preserve the empire was through absolute control. Political freedoms were reduced. Revolutionary groups were hunted relentlessly by the secret police. Universities were monitored, newspapers censored, and public criticism of the monarchy suppressed. The Romanov state tightened its grip on society. Yet Alexander III was not merely reacting with fear. He genuinely believed that Russia possessed a unique identity that needed protection. Western ideas of liberal government, he argued, were dangerous imports that threatened the stability of Russian tradition. Under his rule, the official ideology of orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality grew even stronger. The Orthodox Church reinforced spiritual unity. The monarchy reinforced political authority, and Russian culture was promoted as the binding force of the empire. For a time, this approach appeared successful. Alexander's reign was relatively stable. Industrial development expanded slowly. Railways stretched across the country, linking remote regions to growing urban centers. Perhaps the most ambitious project of this era was the beginning of the Trans-Siberian Railway in 1891, a massive undertaking that would eventually connect Moscow with the Pacific coast. Yet even as the empire modernized, its social structure remained deeply unequal. At the top stood the aristocracy and royal court, surrounded by unimaginable wealth. The Romanovs lived in palaces filled with marble halls, gold-trimmed ceilings, and vast collections of art and jewels. Ceremonial events displayed the splendor of imperial Russia, reinforcing the image of a dynasty chosen by divine right to rule. But far from those glittering halls, millions of ordinary Russians lived in poverty. Industrial workers crowded into expanding cities, laboring long hours in factories under harsh conditions. Peasants in the countryside struggled to survive on small plots of land that barely supported their families. The different Russias seemed to exist side by side, one of imperial grandeur and one of quiet hardship. The next Romanov ruler would inherit both. When Alexander III died in 1894, the throne passed to his eldest son, Nicholas II. Nicholas was only 26 years old when he became Tsar. Gentle, polite, and devoted to his family. Nicholas lacked the commanding presence of his father. Those who met him often described him as courteous but reserved, a man more comfortable in private conversation than in the public theater of imperial leadership. Yet Nicholas carried one unshakable belief. He believed the monarchy existed by the will of God. Soon after his coronation, Nicholas declared, "I shall maintain the principle of autocracy, just as firmly and unflinchingly as did my father." Those words reassured conservatives who feared reform, but they worried those who hoped Russia might gradually evolve toward a more representative government. Nicholas's reign began with an event that would cast an early shadow over his rule. In May 1896, celebrations for the new Tsar's coronation were held in Moscow. Thousands gathered on Kodinka Field, where food and gifts were promised to the crowds. But poor organization and rumors that supplies would run out created panic. As tens of thousands surged forward, people were knocked to the ground and crushed beneath the crowd. More than 1,300 people died in what became known as the Kodinka tragedy. The disaster deeply shocked the nation. Many expected the young Tsar to cancel the remaining festivities out of respect for the victims. Instead, Nicholas attended a lavish diplomatic ball that same evening. Though the decision was largely influenced by advisors and diplomatic obligations, the damage to his public image was immediate. Whispers began to circulate. Was the new Tsar truly connected to the struggles of his people? As the years passed, further challenges appeared. Industrialization accelerated across Russia during the late 19th century. Factories multiplied in cities like St. Petersburg, Moscow, and Kiev, bringing thousands of rural migrants into crowded urban districts. With them came new political ideas. Workers began forming unions and protest groups, demanding better wages and conditions. Intellectual circles discussed socialism, anarchism, and other revolutionary ideologies that criticized the foundations of imperial rule. Meanwhile, trouble also emerged inside the Romanov household itself. Nicholas had married Princess Alexandra of Hesse, a German-born royal who became Empress Alexandra Fyodorovna after converting to Russian Orthodoxy. Though deeply devoted to her husband and children, Alexandra struggled to connect with Russian society. Many nobles viewed her with suspicion because of her foreign origins. Her intense religious faith and quiet personality made her appear distant. In public life, rumors and gossip spread easily within the aristocratic circles of St. Petersburg. Yet, the most painful challenge facing the imperial family remained hidden from the public. Their only son and heir, Tsarevich Alexei, suffered from hemophilia, a genetic condition that prevented his blood from clotting properly. Even minor injuries could become life-threatening. The illness placed enormous emotional strain on the family. Desperate to find relief for her son's suffering, Empress Alexandra eventually turned to a wandering Siberian mystic named Grigory Rasputin. Rasputin appeared capable of calming Alexei. During dangerous bleeding episodes, possibly through hypnosis or simple reassurance, to Alexandra, he seemed like a miracle. To the Russian public, however, his growing influence over the royal family became deeply controversial. Stories spread through newspapers and gossip networks suggesting that the mysterious monk held dangerous power within the imperial court. Whether true or exaggerated, the rumors damaged the reputation of the Romanov dynasty. The distance between the rulers and the ruled continued to grow. Then came the crisis that would push the empire closer to open confrontation. In 1904, Russia entered a war with Japan over territorial disputes in East Asia. Many Russian leaders expected a quick victory against what they considered a smaller and less powerful nation. Instead, the war ended in humiliating defeat. Russian fleets were destroyed. Soldiers suffered devastating losses. The government appeared unprepared and ineffective. Public frustration erupted in when peaceful protesters marched toward the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, carrying icons and petitions for reform. They hoped to appeal directly to the Tsar. But troops guarding the palace fired upon the crowd. The event became known as Bloody Sunday. Hundreds were killed or wounded. Across the empire, strikes and uprisings followed. For the first time, the Romanov regime faced a nationwide revolutionary movement. Under immense pressure, Nicholas II, reluctantly, agreed to create a representative assembly known as the Duma. For a moment, it seemed that Russia might move toward constitutional government. But Nicholas soon limited the powers of the new institution, dissolving early sessions that challenged his authority. The rivalry between imperial power and the rising forces of reform had now become unmistakable. Russia stood balanced between two futures. One clung to centuries of autocratic tradition. The other demanded political transformation. Between them stood the Romanov dynasty, still surrounded by palaces and ceremony, yet increasingly isolated from the nation it ruled. The stage for a far greater conflict had been set by the early 20th century. The Russian Empire appeared powerful on maps, yet increasingly fragile in reality. Vast territories still stretched across Europe and Asia. The imperial court still glittered beneath chandeliers in the Winter Palace, and the Romanov dynasty still commanded the loyalty of armies and nobles. But beneath that surface, pressure was building. The reforms following the 1905 revolution had failed to heal the empire's deeper divisions. The Duma, Russia's new parliament, existed in theory as a voice for the people. In practice, however, its authority remained limited. Whenever representatives challenged imperial decisions too strongly, the Tsar dissolved the assembly and replaced it with a more compliant one. To many Russians, the promise of reform began to feel hollow. Industrial workers continued to labor under exhausting conditions. Peasants still struggled with poverty and land shortages. Political activists, socialists, liberals, and revolutionaries debated how Russia's future should be shaped. And at the center of this increasingly restless empire stood Tsar Nicholas II, a ruler whose personal sincerity could not overcome his political rigidity. Nicholas genuinely believed he was protecting Russia by preserving autocracy. He saw compromise as weakness and feared that reform might unleash uncontrollable forces. Ironically, that fear would soon become reality. The spark that ignited the next stage of crisis arrived not from within Russia, but from Europe. In August 1914, the outbreak of World War I transformed the continent. After the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo, alliances quickly pulled the major powers into conflict. Russia entered the war as part of the Triple Entente, fighting alongside France and Britain against Germany and Austria-Hungary. At first, patriotism swept through Russian cities. Crowds gathered in public squares, singing the national anthem. Many believed the war would unite the country and strengthen the monarchy. Soldiers marched toward the front with banners and prayers, convinced they were defending their homeland. But war has a way of revealing the weaknesses of nations. Russia's army was enormous, yet poorly equipped. Many soldiers went into battle with outdated rifles or insufficient ammunition. Some units were even forced to share weapons, waiting for fallen comrades before they could arm themselves. The losses mounted quickly. By 1915, millions of Russian soldiers had been killed, wounded, or captured. Entire divisions disappeared on the Eastern Front as German forces advanced deeper into Russian territory. The situation alarmed the Tsar. In a decision that would have enormous consequences. Nicholas II chose to take personal command of the Russian army in September 1915. Believing his presence would inspire the troops, he left the capital and moved to the military headquarters of Mogilev. But this decision created an unexpected political vacuum. With the Tsar away at the front, daily governance of the empire fell largely into the hands of Empress Alexandra, and Alexandra trusted one man above all others: Grigory Rasputin. Rasputin's influence over the imperial family had grown steadily because of his apparent ability to ease the suffering of the young heir, Tsarevich Alexei, during his dangerous bleeding episodes. To Alexandra, Rasputin seemed like a divine protector sent to save her son. But to much of Russian society, he represented something far darker. Rumors circulated that Rasputin manipulated government appointments, whispering advice into the ear of the Empress, while the Tsar remained far away at the front. Newspapers and political figures portrayed him as a corrupt mystic whose influence threatened the stability of the state. Whether exaggerated or true, the damage was severe. Confidence in the monarchy eroded rapidly. Meanwhile, the war continued to drain the empire's strength. Transportation networks struggled to deliver food to growing cities. Bread shortages became common in Petrograd, wartime name for St. Petersburg. Winter deepened the crisis. Long queues formed outside bakeries as women waited 4 hours in freezing temperatures. Factories slowed production due to lack of fuel. Workers grew angry. Soldiers stationed in the capital became restless. Even within the aristocracy, anxiety spread. Some nobles quietly concluded that the Romanov dynasty was steering the empire toward disaster. In December 1916, a group of aristocrats attempted a desperate solution. Believing Rasputin's influence endangered the monarchy itself, they lured him to a palace in Petrograd and murdered him. They hoped that removing the mystic would restore faith in the Tsar. Instead, it changed nothing. By early 1917, Russia was exhausted by war, crippled by shortages, and deeply distrustful of its own government. The empire that the Romanovs had ruled for more than 3 centuries stood dangerously close to breaking. All it needed now was a single spark. The spark arrived in the bitter cold of February 1917. Winter had tightened its grip on Petrograd, and the city felt the full weight of Russia's exhaustion. Snow-covered streets carried the sounds of restless crowds, and the long queues outside bakeries had grown longer each day. Women waited for hours in the freezing air, hoping to secure bread for their families. Often, the bread never came. Food shortages had become one of the most visible consequences of the war. Russia still possessed vast farmland, but the transportation system had collapsed under the strain of military logistics. Trains carrying grain to cities were frequently delayed or redirected to the front lines. For ordinary citizens, hunger slowly transformed frustration into anger. On the 23rd of February 1917, which coincided with International Women's Day, of women working in Petrograd's textile factories left their machines and marched into the streets. Their demand was simple: bread. At first, the demonstration seemed like many protests that had occurred before. Workers chanted slogans and carried banners through the city. Yet something about this protest was different. It did not fade. For longing. Day, more factories joined the strike. Metalworkers, laborers, and students poured into Petrograd's streets. Within days, the protests had grown into a mass movement involving nearly 200,000 workers. Crowds filled the broad avenues near the Nevsky Prospect, shouting not only for bread but also for political change. The government responded with familiar methods. Troops were ordered to disperse the crowds. At first, many soldiers obeyed. Warning shots echoed across the city as soldiers attempted to force demonstrators back into side streets. But the mood of the army had also been changing. Many soldiers stationed in Petrograd had recently returned from the brutal front lines. They were exhausted, hungry, and increasingly sympathetic to the protesters. On the 26th of February, Nicholas II, still at military headquarters far from the capital, ordered that the demonstrations be crushed by force. The command followed the traditional logic of imperial authority. Rebellion must be suppressed before it could spread. But something unexpected happened. Several military units refused to fire on the crowds. In one dramatic moment, soldiers from the Volinsky regiment mutinied against their officers, rather than shoot at civilians. Soon, other units followed their example. Instead of defending the government, soldiers began joining the demonstrators. The balance of power in the city shifted almost overnight. Police stations were attacked. Government buildings were seized. Weapons were distributed among protesters. As the uprising transformed into a full-scale revolution, Petrograd was no longer under imperial control. Inside the Tauride Palace, members of the Duma Russia's parliament gathered urgently to decide how to respond. Although the Tsar had previously dissolved the assembly, many deputies refused to obey the order. They believed abandoning their positions would leave the capital in chaos. A provisional committee was formed to restore order and assume temporary authority. At the same time, workers and soldiers organized their own governing council, known as the Petrograd Soviet. This body quickly gained influence by representing the interests of the revolutionary crowds. For the first time in centuries, two rival centers of power existed in the Russian capital. Meanwhile, Tsar Nicholas II remained far away, receiving incomplete reports about the rapidly unfolding crisis. Determined to regain control, he attempted to travel back to Petrograd, but the railway lines were blocked by rebellious troops. The emperor of one of the largest empires in the world suddenly found himself unable to reach his own capital. Events moved quickly after that. Military commanders, aristocrats, and government ministers began sending urgent messages to the Tsar. They warned him that the situation could no longer be resolved through force alone. The loyalty of the army, once the backbone of Romanov authority, was no longer guaranteed. Some advisors offered a final solution. If Nicholas abdicated the throne, perhaps the monarchy could survive under a different ruler. Reluctantly, the Tsar began to consider the unimaginable. On the 2nd of March 1917, inside a railway carriage near the city of Pskov, Nicholas II signed a document that ended more than 3 centuries of Romanov. Ruler's abdication statement was brief, but momentous. He renounced the throne not only for himself, but also for his young son, Alexei, whose fragile health made leadership impossible. Instead, Nicholas suggested that the crown pass to his brother, Grand Duke Michael, but Michael declined. Without a monarch willing to claim the throne, the Romanov dynasty effectively came to an end. Across Petrograd, news of the abdication spread quickly. Crowds celebrated in the streets. Red banners appeared across the city. Political prisoners were released from jails, and revolutionary songs echoed through public squares. For many Russians, the fall of the monarchy felt like the beginning of a new era, an opportunity to build a more just and representative society. Yet beneath the celebrations, uncertainty lingered. The old system had collapsed, but the new one had not yet fully formed. The provisional government now faced the enormous challenge of leading a country still at war, still suffering from economic crises, and still deeply divided by political ideology and far from the cheering crowds. The former Tsar and his family quietly entered a new chapter of their lives. They were no longer rulers of Russia. They were prisoners of its revolution. Asterisk. When Tsar Nicholas II abdicated on the 2nd of March, 1917, the fall of the Romanov dynasty happened, with surprising quietness. There was no final battle at the gates of the Winter Palace, no dramatic last stand of loyal soldiers defending the throne. Instead, the monarchy that had ruled Russia for more than 3 centuries simply dissolved under the weight of revolution, war, and exhaustion. Yet the end of Romanov power did not immediately bring clarity to Russia's future. It created uncertainty. For the first time since 1613, Russia had no Tsar. The provisional government, formed by members of the Duma, now attempted to lead the country through a delicate transition. Its leaders hoped to establish a democratic political system while continuing Russia's involvement in World War I alongside its allies. But the situation was far more complicated. While the provisional government claimed official authority, real power on the streets often belonged to the Petrograd Soviet, the council representing workers and soldiers. 2 governments now existed. Simultaneously, this fragile arrangement became known as dual power. It was a temporary compromise, but one filled with tension. The provisional government wanted stability and gradual reform. The Soviet demanded immediate change and greater representation for the working class. Meanwhile, the Romanov family quietly faded from public life. After his abdication, Nicholas II returned to the imperial residence at Tsarskoye Selo, where he reunited with his wife, Empress Alexandra, and their 5 children, Olga, Tatiana, Maria Anastasia, and Alexei. Their lives had changed completely. The palace gates remained guarded, but now the soldiers stood not as protectors, but as watchful observers. The family's movements were restricted. Letters were monitored. Former servants had been dismissed. They were no longer rulers. They were prisoners. Despite these restrictions, the Romanovs attempted to maintain a sense of routine. Nicholas spent time reading and walking in the palace gardens. The children studied lessons and helped with household chores. Alexandra focused her attention on caring for the fragile health of her son. From the outside, life appeared strangely calm. But beyond the palace walls, Russia continued to unravel. The provisional government struggled to address the nation's growing crises. Food shortages persisted in cities. Peasants began seizing land from nobles in the countryside. Soldiers at the front grew increasingly unwilling to continue fighting a devastating war. Political radicalism expanded rapidly. Among the most organized revolutionary groups were the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin. Unlike moderate reformers, Lenin argued that the provisional government represented the interests of the elite rather than the people. He called for a complete transfer of power to the Soviet's workers' councils that he believed could build a socialist state. Throughout 1917, tensions between political factions intensified. In July, protests erupted in Petrograd as workers and soldiers demanded an immediate end to the war. Although the uprising failed, it revealed how unstable the government had become. Meanwhile, the Romanovs faced a growing dilemma. The provisional government feared that leaving the former imperial family in the capital might encourage monarchist supporters to attempt a rescue. To prevent this possibility, officials decided to move them away from Petrogra. In August 1917, the Romanovs were transported across Russia to the Siberian town of Tobolsk. The journey marked a dramatic transformation. Once accustomed to imperial trains and elaborate ceremonies, the family now traveled under military escort. Guards watched closely as they arrived at the modest governor's house that would become their new residence. Life in Tobolsk was quiet, but restricted. Tried to preserve a sense of dignity despite their circumstances. They planted small gardens, read books, and spent long evenings together as a family. Nicholas reportedly wrote in his diary during this period, "We are far from the noise of politics now. Life continues quietly, but events beyond Tobolsk continued to move rapidly." In October 1917, Lenin and the Bolsheviks launched a second revolution in Petrograd. Armed supporters seized key government buildings, and the provisional government collapsed with little resistance. The Bolsheviks now controlled Russia. Their priorities were clear: end the war, redistribute land, and secure their power against all. Opposition. The Romanovs suddenly became a serious political problem. For the Bolsheviks, the former imperial family represented a powerful symbol for potential counter-revolutionary forces. Monarchists, fighting against the Bolsheviks in the developing Russian Civil War, might attempt to restore the Romanov dynasty. As long as the family lived, that possibility remained. In April 1918, the Romanovs were moved again, this time to the industrial city of Yekaterinburg in the Ural Mountains. Their new prison was the Aperitif House, later known ominously as the House of Special Purpose. Conditions were far harsher than before. Windows were sealed or covered. Guards controlled every movement within the house. Personal belongings were confiscated. Even private conversations were sometimes overheard by watchful sentries. The family's isolation deepened, yet the Romanovs remained together. Nicholas continued writing in his diary. Alexandra spent long hours reading religious texts. The daughters helped care for their younger brother Alexei, whose illness made movement difficult. Outside the house, however, the world was changing rapidly. The Russian Civil War had begun. Anti-Bolshevik forces known as the White Army were advancing toward Yekaterinburg. Their objective was clear: to overthrow the Bolsheviks and restore order to Russia. For local Bolshevik leaders, this development created an urgent dilemma. If white forces captured the city, they might rescue the Romanovs and use them as a rallying symbol against the revolution. The dynasty that had once ruled Russia now stood at the center of a deadly political calculation. By the summer of 1918, the situation around Yekaterinburg grew increasingly tense. The sound of distant fighting echoed across the region as civil war approached. Inside the Aperitif House, the Romanovs remained unaware of the full danger surrounding them. They believed they might eventually be moved again, perhaps even rescued. But the Bolsheviks had begun discussing a different solution, a permanent one. On the evening of the 16th of July 1918, preparations quietly began within the house. Guards received new orders. Certain rooms were cleared. Weapons were distributed among a small group of men chosen for a grim task. Shortly after midnight, the Romanov family was awakened. They were told that unrest in the city required them to move to a safer location within the house. Nicholas carried the sickly Alexei downstairs. The family gathered in a small basement room along with several loyal servants. Moments later, armed guards entered. What followed would mark the final chapter of a dynasty that had ruled Russia for more than 300 years. The Romanov era had ended with abdication, but its true conclusion was still moments away. In the early hours of the 17th of July, 1918, the Romanov dynasty reached its final moment. Inside the Aperitif House in the former imperial family waited in a dimly lit basement room. The air was heavy and still. A few chairs had been brought in. The walls were bare, the windows shuttered. Nicholas sat quietly, holding his son, Alexei, whose fragile health made standing difficult. Nearby stood Empress Alexandra and their daughters Zalga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasian women who had grown up surrounded by the rituals and splendor of imperial life. Now they stood in silence. The guards entered the room shortly after midnight, led by a Bolshevik officer named Yakov Vierovsky. He carried a written order. Nicholas looked toward him with confusion. Then Vierovsky spoke. He informed the former Tsar that, due to the ongoing civil war and the advance of anti-Bolshevik forces, the Ural Soviet had decided to execute the entire family. For a brief moment, the words seemed almost unreal. Nicholas reportedly turned toward his family and said simply, "What? What?" There was no time for further explanation. The execution squad raised their weapons. Gunfire erupted within the narrow basement. The room filled with smoke, shouting, and chaos as bullets struck the walls and floor. Some members of the family wore hidden jewels sewn into their clothing, valuables they had carried secretly during captivity. The stones acted like armor, deflecting several shots and prolonging the grim scene. Within minutes, however, the firing stopped. Tsar Nicholas II, Empress Alexandra, their 5 children, and 4 loyal attendants lay lifeless on the floor. The dynasty that had begun in 1613 with the young Tsar Mikhail Romanov had ended in that small basement room more than 3 centuries later. Outside, the world remained unaware. News of the execution would not fully emerge for years. For a time, rumors spread that members of the family might have survived. But history had already turned. The Romanovs, rulers of one of the largest empires on earth, were gone. And with them vanished the final link to Imperial Russia. When news of the Romanovs' execution slowly began to spread. Russia was already consumed by a brutal and chaotic struggle. The Russian Civil War, 1918 to 1922, had erupted across the vast territory of the former empire. The Bolsheviks, now known as the Red Army, fought against a loose alliance of opposing forces collectively called the White Army. These groups included monarchists, liberals, foreign intervention troops, and regional militias, all united by their desire to defeat the Bolshevik Revolution. In many ways, the Civil War represented the final battle over Russia's future. Would the country return to monarchy? Would it become a democratic republic? Or would Lenin's revolutionary vision of a socialist state prevail? The execution of the Romanovs changed the emotional landscape of that conflict. For monarchist forces, the deaths of Nicholas II and his family were both a tragedy and a rallying cry. The Romanovs had ruled Russia for over 300 years, and their violent and shocked supporters across Europe. Royal families from Britain, Germany, and Denmark, many of whom were related to the Romanovs by blood-watched events in Russia, with yet. Despite their outrage, none had intervened in time to save the dynasty. For the Bolsheviks, the decision to eliminate the Romanovs was deeply pragmatic. As the Civil War intensified, revolutionary leaders feared that the former imperial family could become a powerful symbol for counter-revolution. If the Whites captured them, the Romanovs might be restored to the throne or, at least, used as a unifying figure against the new regime. In that sense, the execution was meant to close a chapter of history permanently. There would be no Romanov restoration, no rallying monarch, no return to imperial rule. The decision was ruthless, but it reflected the uncompromising logic of revolution. Meanwhile, the Civil War itself grew increasingly violent. Entire regions of Russia changed hands repeatedly as armies advanced and retreated. Villages were destroyed, cities starved, and millions of civilians suffered from hunger and disease. The scale of devastation was enormous. Historians estimate that between 7 and 12 million people died during the Civil War and the famines that accompanied it. By comparison, the fall of the Romanov family, tragic as it was, became only one chapter within a much larger national catastrophe. Still, their story continued to haunt the imagination of many Russians. The Romanovs had once embodied the idea of imperial Russia. Their palaces, ceremonies, and traditions symbolized centuries of monarchy. Now those symbols had vanished almost overnight. Yet even as the empire disappeared, its physical reminders remained. The grand palaces of St. Petersburg still stood along the Neva River. The gilded halls of the Winter Palace, once the center of Romanov authority, now housed revolutionary institutions and museums. History had not erased the past. It had simply repurposed it. By 1920, the Bolsheviks had gained the upper hand in the Civil War. Their armies defeated most organized opposition and secured control over the former imperial territories. 2 years later, in 1922, the revolutionary government formally created a new state, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, better known as the Soviet Union. This new nation rejected the monarchy entirely. Instead of emperors and dynasties, it promoted the ideals of socialist governance, collective ownership, and revolutionary leadership. The Romanov era was officially portrayed as a time of oppression and inequality, a system that the revolution had heroically overthrown. For decades, the Soviet government discouraged public discussion of the Romanovs as individuals. Their deeds were rarely explored in detail, and the Ipatiev house itself was eventually demolished in 1977, from becoming a site of monarchist pilgrimage. But history has a curious way of resurfacing. Even under strict ideological control, the memory of the Romanovs never fully disappeared. Stories about the lost dynasty circulated quietly among families and historians. Rumors spread that one of the imperial daughters, Zofan, Anastasia, might have survived the execution. Though these claims were later proven false through DNA testing, they revealed something deeper. The Romanov story had become legend. Their fall represented not only the collapse of a royal family, but the dramatic transformation of an entire nation. And as Russia continued to evolve through the 20th century, the legacy of that transformation would remain impossible to ignore. Even after the Romanov dynasty vanished from power, its presence remained etched across the landscape of Russia. Empires do not disappear quietly. They leave behind cities, monuments, traditions, and stories, physical reminders of the people who once shaped them. For the Romanovs, those reminders were everywhere. Walk along the banks of the Neva River in St. Petersburg, and the past still reveals itself in layers of stone and gold. The city itself was the greatest monument to Romanov ambition. When Peter the Great founded St. Petersburg in 1703, he had imagined more than a capital. He envisioned a symbol proof that Russia could stand among the great powers of Europe. Wide boulevards replaced narrow medieval streets. Grand palaces rose beside elegant canals. Foreign architects were invited to design buildings that combined Russian traditions with European refinement. The result was a city that felt unlike any other in the empire. Visitors arriving from across Europe often described St. Petersburg with astonishment. The Winter Palace, residence of the Romanov rulers for generations, stretched across the riverfront in magnificent green and white facades. Inside, endless halls glittered with chandeliers, marble staircases, and golden ceilings. These rooms had witnessed centuries of imperial life. Diplomats negotiating treaties, royal weddings, and elaborate coronation celebrations. Military commanders reporting victories that expanded the empire's borders. For the architecture had always been a form of power. Palaces and cathedrals were not merely residences or places of worship. They were symbols meant to inspire awe and reinforce authority. The empire's rulers understood that grandeur could communicate strength as effectively as armies. The Peter and Paul fortress, standing on a small island in the Neva, served as another powerful symbol. Within its cathedral rested the tombs of Russian emperors and empresses, beginning with Peter the Great himself. For centuries, Romanov rulers were laid to rest there, beneath white marble sarcophagi that reflected the dynasty's long continuity. Yet after the revolution, Tisicin gained new meanings. The Bolsheviks rejected the monarchy and its traditions, but they did not destroy every reminder of imperial Russia. Many Romanov palaces were transformed into museums, government offices, or cultural institutions. The Winter Palace, once the private residence of the Tsars, became part of the State Hermitage Museum, one of the largest and most famous art collections in the world, where imperial banquets had once been held. Visitors now walk through galleries filled with masterpieces by Leonardo da Vinci, Rembrandt, and Michelangelo. The buildings remained, but the purpose had changed elsewhere. Traces of Romanov history survived in quieter ways. Throughout Russia, towns and villages still carried names tied to imperial figures. Streets, bridges, and institutions quietly preserved echoes of the dynasty's influence. Even cultural traditions from court ceremonies to artistic stuff. Centuries of Romanov patronage. Yet the most haunting monument connected to the family's story stood far from the splendor of St. Petersburg. It stood in Yekaterinburg. For decades after the execution of the Romanovs, the Ipatiev house remained largely unknown to the outside world. Soviet authorities avoided public discussion of the event, and the building itself served ordinary administrative functions. But by the 1970s, rumors about the site began attracting visitors curious about the fate of the imperial family, concerned that the house might become a pilgrimage site for monarchists. Soviet officials made a controversial decision. In 1977, the Ipatiev house was demolished. The building where the Romanovs had spent their final days disappeared beneath bulldozers, as if removing it might erase the memory of what had occurred there. But history is not. Oisili, Irest. After the collapse of the Soviet Union in Russia entered a period of reassessing its past. Historians, archaeologists, and researchers began investigating the final chapter of the Romanov story more openly. In 1991, remains believed to belong to the imperial family were discovered in a forest near Yek. For years, scientific tests attempted to confirm their identities. Eventually, DNA analysis verified that the remains belonged to Tsar Nicholas II, Empress Alexandra, and several members of their family. The discovery transformed the historical narrative. In 1998, 80 years after their deaths, the Romanovs were given a formal burial ceremony in St. Peter and Paul Cathedral in St. Petersburg, the traditional resting place of Russian emperors. The ceremony carried powerful symbolism. Representatives of the Russian government attended, members of European royal families traveled to Russia, and thousands of ordinary citizens gathered outside the cathedral, watching quietly as the coffins were carried inside. For the first time in generations, the Romanov story was acknowledged, publicly. Yet perhaps the most striking monument appeared at the site where the Ipatiev house once stood. In 2003, the church on the blood was completed in Yek. Built directly over the location of the Romanovs' execution, the church rose with golden domes that gleamed above the city skyline. Its full name, the Church of All Saints, in honor of the imperial family, revealed its purpose. The Russian Orthodox Church had officially recognized Nicholas II and his family as passion bearers. In the year 2000, honoring their suffering and deaths. Inside the church, icons depict the Romanovs not as rulers, but as martyrs. Visitors walk through quiet halls, where photographs and historical exhibits recount the events of July 1918. Candles flicker before painted images of the imperial family, now surrounded by the symbols of religious reverence. The contrast is striking. A family once associated with imperial wealth and political authority has become part of Russia's spiritual narrative. History, it seems, had transformed them. Yet, monuments and churches tell only part of the Romanov legacy. The dynasty's deeper influence lies in how it shaped Russia itself. During 3 centuries of rule, the Romanovs expanded the nation's borders across Siberia, Central Asia, and Eastern Europe. They founded cities, built institutions, and oversaw the transformation of Russia into a global power. At the same time, their rule preserved systems like serfdom and autocratic governance that contributed to the social tensions eventually leading to revolution. Their legacy, therefore, remains complicated. For some, the Romanovs symbolize imperial grandeur and cultural achievement. For others, They represent a system of inequality and rigid authority that failed to adapt to a changing world. Both interpretations contain truth. The palaces of St. Petersburg still shine beneath northern sunlight. The golden domes of cathedrals still rise above ancient cities. And somewhere between those symbols between splendor and tragedy, memory of the Romanov dynasty continues to endure. Asterisk empires rarely fall in a single moment. Even when a dynasty disappears, the consequences of its rise and collapse continue to shape history long afterward. The Romanovs ruled Russia for more than 3 centuries, guiding the country through wars, reforms, territorial expansion, and dramatic transformation. Yet by the time their dynasty ended in 1918, the empire they once commanded had already begun dissolving. The revolution did not simply remove a ruling family. It dismantled an entire system. Under the Bolsheviks, Russia abandoned monarchy, aristocratic privilege, and imperial governance. In their place came a radically different political vision, one built upon socialist ideology, revolutionary leadership, and the promise of a society without hereditary rulers. For the first time since 1630, the Romanov name carried no authority. Within the country it once ruled on. In fact, for decades, the Soviet state actively discouraged nostalgia for the imperial past. Official histories portrayed the Romanov era as a period of oppression in which ordinary Russians suffered under autocratic rule. Schools taught the revolution as a necessary liberation. The Tsars, once presented as God's chosen rulers, became symbols of a failed system, yet outside official narratives. The memory of the Romanovs remained more complicated. Among Russian émigrés, those who fled the revolution and settled in Europe, Asia, and the Americas, the Romanov dynasty became a powerful symbol of a lost homeland. Many exiled nobles and former officers of the imperial army continued to speak of the monarchy with longing. In cities such as Paris, Berlin, and London, Russian expatriate communities gathered in cafes and churches, preserving traditions from a vanished world. Portraits of Nicholas II still hung on the walls of some homes. Stories about imperial life were told to children who had never seen Russia itself. For these families, the fall of the Romanovs represented not merely political change, but the disappearance of an entire cultural identity. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union continued to reshape Russia throughout the 20th century. Under Joseph Stalin, who rose to power after Lenin's death, the state pursued rapid industrialization and strict political control. The country transformed from a largely agricultural society into a major industrial power, though the process came with enormous human cost. Millions suffered through political purges, forced labor camps, and famine. Ironically, some historians later observed that the Soviet leadership, despite rejecting monarchy, often ruled with a centralized authority. Reminiscent of earlier Tsars, power remained concentrated in a small group at the top of the political system. The symbols had changed, but the structure of power sometimes felt familiar. As decades passed, interest in the Romanov story slowly returned. Historians began re-examining the final years of Imperial Russia, asking difficult questions about how the dynasty had lost its grip on power. Some argued that Nicholas II's refusal to embrace meaningful reforms sealed the monarchy's fate. Others suggested that the pressures of World War I would have destabilized any government, no matter how capable. The debate continues among scholars. Today, what remains undeniable is the scale of transformation triggered by the dynasty's collapse. The fall of the Romanovs cleared the path for one of the most influential political experiments in modern history, the creation of the Soviet Union, a state that would shape global politics for much of the 20th century. From the Cold War to space exploration, the consequences of the revolution reached far beyond Russia's borders. Yet history's perspective shifted once again with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. As Russia emerged from decades of communist rule, many people began reevaluating the nation's imperial past. Interest in the Romanovs grew among historians, cultural institutions, and the public. Books, documentaries, and museum exhibitions explored the dynasty's history with new openness. The Romanovs were no longer viewed only as symbols of autocracy. They were also seen as individual parents, children, rulers facing immense pressures during an era of extraordinary change. This shift in perspective culminated in several powerful symbolic moments. The discovery and identification of the Romanov remains in the 1990s allowed the family to receive a proper burial in 1998, returning them to the resting place of their ancestors. 2 years later, in 2000, the Russian Orthodox Church canonized Nicholas II and his family, recognizing them as religious figures who had faced suffering with dignity. These developments did not restore the monarchy, but they revealed something important about the enduring complexity of the Romanov legacy. For many Russians, the dynasty's story now carries elements of tragedy, reflection, and historical curiosity rather than simple political judgment. The Romanovs once governed a vast empire filled with splendor, ceremony, and ambition. Yet their final years revealed how fragile power can become when rulers grow distant from the realities of their people. The dynasty had begun with a 16-year-old boy chosen to bring stability to a broken nation. 3 centuries later, it ended with a family standing quietly in abasement, far from the palaces their ancestors had built. Between those two moments lies one of the most remarkable and sobering stories in the history of power. History often remembers empires through their victories, the battles won, the cities built, the borders expanded across maps. But the story of the Romanov dynasty reminds us that power is never measured by triumph alone. For more than 300 years, the Romanovs ruled one of the largest empires the world had ever seen. Their authority stretched across frozen tundra, endless forests, and vast plains that reached from Eastern Europe to the Pacific Ocean. They built magnificent cities, Rice said, golden-domed cathedrals, and transformed Russia into a force that shaped the balance of power across continents. From the cautious leadership of Mikhail, chosen during a time of national desperation, to the sweeping reforms of Peter the Great, the dynasty carried Russia from fragile recovery to imperial grandeur. Palaces rose along the Neva River. Armies marched beneath imperial banners. The Romanov name became inseparable from the identity of Russia itself. Yet history rarely allows power to remain untouched by consequence. The same system that built the Roman Empire also created the tensions that eventually brought it down. Beneath the splendor of imperial courts, millions struggled under rigid social structures. Beneath the confidence of autocratic rule, new political ideas slowly gathered strength. When change finally arrived, it did not arrive gently. War, revolution, and political upheaval swept away centuries of tradition in only a few years. The dynasty that had once commanded unimaginable authority ended its story not in a palace, but in a quiet basement, far from the capital it had ruled. It is a striking contrast. A family that once governed an empire larger than any kingdom in Europe, reduced to prisoners within their own country. So what, ultimately, did the Romanovs leave behind? They left cities, institutions, and cultural achievements that still shape Russia today. The beauty of St. Petersburg, the influence of Russian art and architecture, and the expansion of a nation across continents all bear the imprint of their rule. But they also left a lesson history often repeats. Power can build empires, but it cannot guarantee their survival. The Romanovs won greatness. Yet in the end, they lost the very nation they had spent centuries shaping. And perhaps that is the quiet truth behind many of history's greatest dynasties. What they build may endure, but the power that created it rarely does.